All right. We've still got a couple that are still joining. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I am Kerry. I am a member of Anderson's events team, and I am here tonight to help get this great, awesome event actually off the ground. I am super excited for tonight. Before we get going, I'm just going to give you guys a couple of tips, housekeeping. Your microphones and cameras are off, and they will remain off through the entire event. But if you have questions, you can go ahead and just put those right through the chat for the event. I will be monitoring that the entire event, and I will be feeding questions to our authors during our question and answer period, which will come along when they are done with their discussion. Let's see, let's get going then. Like I said, I'm Kerry from Anderson's, and quick history about Anderson's Bookshop. We have been selling books independently since 1875. We're very proud of that point. We've made it through a lot of things, and we've made it through the Spanish flu, and we're gonna make it through this time. We are just incredibly grateful that for those of you who have followed us from our regular events format, which was up to 400 events plus a year, really across all our locations, to this somewhat new and sometimes frustrating virtual events landscape. And we're building it from the ground up, and we greatly appreciate your support of our events and of your continued support of Anderson's, because your purchase of a ticket tonight, your purchase of a book tonight, it really keeps us here for one thing, but it also allows us to continue to bring in quality programming like we have tonight. Like I mentioned, I am very excited for tonight. Both of these books are phenomenal in that they have the power to really shift mindsets, and they are also going to give you goosebumps, which is always my litmus test for a good book. First, we're going to start with Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, who immigrated to the United States in 1996 after a bachelor's degree from Brown University, plus 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from Columbia University. She became a professor at Columbia, and she works on understanding how and why societies fall apart and what role education can play in rebuilding decimated countries. Her book, The Cat I Never Named, which we will be talking about here tonight, is her memoir of surviving ethnic cleansing in Bosnia as a teenager. Also with us tonight is Kiku Hughes, a cartoonist and illustrator whose work has been featured in several anthology collections. She creates stories about identity, queer romance, and compassionate sci-fi. Displacement is her first graphic novel, which blew my mind when I found that out. And it is a story she's wanted to share for as long as she can remember, and it's a real treat. Both authors will be in conversation tonight with our very own Kathleen March, beloved children's manager at our Downers Grove location, legendary for making lifelong readers out of even the most reluctant of young readers. She is often recalled by generations of children as being one of their favorite parts about growing up in Downers Grove. She hates it when I gush about her.
I know. I don't know which Kathleen you were talking about, but...
So we are set up to have an amazing event. I am going to pop off, and I'm going to let these 3 ladies talk through their stories with you. A reminder to keep going ahead and putting any questions you might have in the chat for the event, and that we will get to answering those, as many as we can, after we are done with our presentation, with our conversation. All right, thanks everybody. Take it, Kathleen.
All right, thanks, Kerry. And thank everybody for being here tonight, but most especially I want to say thank you to Kiku and Amra for not just joining us, but for these 2 amazing books. We've got, oh, sorry, I've got a green screen going. Anyway, oh my gosh. I don't know whether to chastise you both for ripping my heart out and stomping all over it with each of your books, or to thank you and gush for giving us books that are honestly going to be changing lives and perspectives. And I read both of these back to back, one right after the other. And my cat kept looking at me going, "What is the matter with you, woman?" Because I would go from extreme highs to heartbreaking sobs. But, oh, you guys really have given us books that are going to change the world. So thank you both so much for each of these. You're both debut authors. So I thought, let's start there. Let's talk about what the journey was like for both of you writing these books. They're both very, very important stories that are very close to you. Amra, this is your own personal experience, and Kiku, this is based on your great-grandmother's experience, right? Grandmother.
Both,
Yeah,
technically, but
thank
yeah.
you. Yes. Experience. And so very personal stories to you, and what that process was like from the moment you decided you wanted to share these stories with the world to being here tonight. So Amra, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I am absolutely honored to be here with Kiku. As I already shared with you before we started, it is a beautiful book, and there are so many parallels between her story and my story in many ways in terms of messages that we hope to deliver to the world and share with young adults and adults. For me, I'm going to share with you one detail that was sort of a trigger moment to write this story, and that was a couple of years ago. My younger daughter, Dina, who was in 3rd grade, who, by the way, loves seahorses and science and is gifted in math and skipped a grade in math. And as a mom, I'm extremely proud of that because I was a math and physics nerd as well, and still am. She came home from school one day and she asked me, she said, "Mom, what will happen to me and Jana, her older sister, if you and Dad are rounded up as Muslims or immigrants? Will we be left alone?" And that question jolted me. It terrified me. Suddenly, I was seeing myself in my daughter, who I never expected that as a child born in New York City, educated in New York City, would be experiencing similar emotions and asking similar questions that I was asking myself before the war started in Bosnia. And that was the moment that I realized that I wasn't safe in America anymore. And America was looking and sounding different than when I came to the United States. And I'll share that moment with you as well, because I reflected on that moment in a conversation with Dina that day. The war in Bosnia started when I was 16. I spent nearly 4 years living under a complete siege, constant bombing by the Serb military. As a Bosnian Muslim, I stood in the way of this vision that Serbia had for Greater Serbia, a racially pure country, and I had to be eliminated. It didn't really matter who I was. The target was attached on my back. And by the time the war ended, I was 20. I was a broken young woman, came to the United States with broken English. I lost the most beautiful years of my life. People I loved were stolen from me. And I was terrified standing in the immigration line. I thought that there was no chance that America would want someone like me. And when it was my turn for the immigration interview, the immigration officer spent a very long time looking through my papers. I was holding onto the counter of his window, and I really thought I was going to pass out. And at the end, he handed me back my documents, and I thought I was going to hear that you are not admitted, you are rejected from this country. And instead, he touched the fingertips of my hand, and he said, "Ma'am, welcome to the United States of America. I am sorry for what happened to you. You're safe now." And that was the moment that redefined me, that gave me a second chance at life, made me believe in our shared humanity, made me believe that someone saw me as a human being, not the target that needed to be executed. And that is the America that I fell in love with. And I feel that it's slipping, that we're losing it. And I want my book to inspire that kind of America in young readers and adult readers when they read and hear what I had gone through simply for being a Muslim.
Yeah, Kiku, I want to give you the opportunity for that same thing, because again, a very personal story for you, and we'll talk about the similarities with Amra's story. But how was it for you to make that decision to share this story with the world and bringing it to where we are today?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Amra, for your beautiful story and for that really moving introduction. Like, I'm already almost crying. But yeah, I think it is so interesting seeing these two books in conversation, because in some ways I feel like the story that Displacement tells is sort of maybe more about Amra, your daughter's experience, or sort of how she's feeling as a second generation, as a different generation, looking back and sort of trying to understand these horrific experiences that our ancestors, that our parents or our grandparents experienced, and sort of how they fit into our daily life and our identity and who we are. So yeah, Displacement, it tells the story of a teenage version, a fictionalized version of myself being pulled back in time to experience Japanese American incarceration during World War II, alongside my grandmother, who was also 16 when she was removed from her home in San Francisco and forced into a camp in the desert in Utah. And it's a story that I definitely had grown up hearing about, sort of vaguely. And then again, yeah, at the 2016 election, the vitriol and the level of racist fear-mongering and xenophobia that was being really normalized and brought to the forefront during that election not only made me think more about what my grandmother must have gone through, but it also really sort of galvanized the entire Japanese American population. There was a lot of talk among Japanese Americans at the time, really saying, you know, we have to stand up and talk about our experiences and our families' experiences in this country, because the same thing is going to happen again if we don't remind people about, you know, how horrific it was the first time it happened, or not even the first time, because America unfortunately has a long history of doing this same thing over and over again to various populations that are deemed a convenient threat. But yeah, so it was inspiring to see a lot of my fellow Japanese Americans standing up and saying, you know, we are going to be more vocal, we are going to really fight back against these sorts of blatant dog whistles and racist rhetoric. So yeah, that really inspired me to start looking more into my grandmother's experience, and that's sort of how the book came together.
And you touched on something, Kiku, and I wanted to kind of circle back around to it. Ernestina, your grandmother in the story, was 16 when she was pulled away from her home and put in the first internment camp. And Amra, you were 16 when the war started in Bosnia. And one of the things that really struck me, the similarities between both of them, is, you know, the innocence that Ernestina and Amra, you had. Amra, you talk about how in your book, your family wasn't even a practicing Muslim family. It's just something that, like, you had brown hair and, you know, it was something that was just passed down to you. And your grandmother, Kiku Ernestina, again, was just a piece of who she was. You guys hadn't done anything. They hadn't done anything. They were innocents being pulled into this horrific situation. And so I was struck by that similarity between the two. So thank you for, you know, giving those stories. Kiku, I did want to ask you a little bit about your story, because you both have, again, we were talking, you know, these very personal stories. Amra, yours is an autobiography. It's your story. It's everything that happened to you. Kiku, instead of coming at it from that biographical point of view, you decided to give us that little bit of a time travel, that little bit of a sci-fi element. So I'd kind of like to talk to both of you about the way you approached your writing for these stories. Because Kiku, I gotta say, I thought that was a stroke of brilliance to take you and time travel back in time and kind of witness it. So we as readers were almost witnessing it for the first time and almost firsthand through the eyes of you as you were time traveling. And Amra, we witnessed your story through your own words. So you get us to the same point. But Amra, why did you decide to write this as an autobiography as opposed to a historical fiction? And then Kiku, I'll ask you the same question, just reverse.
I think that's an excellent question, an excellent parallel between our books in terms of both characters, if you will, being 16, going through similar emotions and feelings and having shared innocence, but us choosing to treat the story differently in terms of writing. For me, I thought it was important that young adults and adults know that this happened to a living human being. And so fictionalizing it to me would have meant changing my story in some way. And I wanted it to be raw, genuine, honest, uncensored, really sharing this, I would say, whirlpool of emotions that I go through during the war, from beauty of falling in love for the first time in the midst of the war because I decided I was going to kiss a boy before I die,
Yes.
to finding a cat who saves my life repeatedly, to falling into deep depression when I realized that no one cares about what is happening to me. The world has forgotten about these people who are getting killed day in, day out. All those emotions are real for me. They're still here. They have never left me. Someone asked me the other day, how did you get over your trauma? I never did. No one ever does. I can't get over something that I had survived. I can't cure my past. It is just an element, crucial element to who I am today that lives in everything that I do. The work I do as a Columbia University professor, the way I approach my lectures, the way I treat my students is all a reflection of my firm belief that we need to evoke collective empathy. And I thought the most effective way for me to do that is simply to write my story as it happened, when it happened. And I'm going to say something there that I am terrible in remembering dates. For instance, I am terrible in remembering whether it was Wednesday or Thursday when my house was blown up. My mother, on the other hand, who's history and geography teacher, remembers all of the dates. But I need to smell something or hear a song or see a particular thread, cloth, a book, hear a word for all of my memories to come back rushing. And I can smell the stench, alcoholic stench of a Serb soldier who attempted to rape me. I see the blood on the pavement. All those scenes are just what happened. And again, to me, it was crucial that young adults and adults realize this can happen anywhere. I think there is sort of a sense of privilege in America that somehow we're saved from the terrible tragedies that the rest of the world experiences. And I've learned in my life that hatred is not exclusive to any one nation, any one group of people, or any one person. We're all capable of it, and we're watching it unfold in America today.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll touch on that. But Kiku, again, I wanted to talk to you about, you choosing to come at it from the fiction perspective as opposed to writing the biography of your grandmother or your great-grandmother in the camp.
Yeah, sort of a similar but opposite experience. I unfortunately was never able to meet my grandmother because she died long before I was born. So a big part of sort of one of the initial hurdles of writing Displacement was how little I knew about just who she was. Like, I didn't feel like I could give her an authentic voice. And so really the time travel aspect, which I want to shout out Octavia Butler's Kindred, which inspired me hugely, not only in terms of the way that time travel can sort of represent trauma, but also just in pushing the boundaries of sci-fi in every book that she wrote. But yeah, so I used that as a way to, it almost felt disrespectful to try to put a voice to my grandmother who I had never met. And so in the book, my character actually never gets to interact directly with Ernestina, with my grandmother, because that's something that I'm never going to get to experience. But I felt like I wanted to show her experience in camp with only the resources that I had, which were sort of limited resources on what camp was like, listening to archived interviews with people who actually experienced camp. But I knew I wouldn't be able to really capture every exact detail, every exact emotion. I knew I couldn't do that because I didn't experience it myself. So I felt like that creating that sort of distance and that sort of, I guess, fictional element was a way for me to really express how, even though these historical events still affect us, the details and the specific moments we can never know, and why we can't know that is a big part of the story as well. The sort of things that get lost through generations are an important part of that trauma, why certain things weren't passed down to us, and we may never know the full extent of the experiences.
Yeah, you even touch on that in your book, and I have Post-it notes, which I'd show you, but the virtual background, so you don't see the yucky basement in the store where I'm at, is gonna prevent me from doing that. But you talk about that. Being from the future meant very little when my education of the past was so limited. And I think that just speaks to both stories and why this is so important to have these stories with us. So thank you for reminding us of the good in people, because there are some good in both of these stories, but what evils we can do to each other. And it's important to be able to openly discuss and learn about our past, both the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? So that we don't repeat, which I'm not sure that that's ever going to happen. We don't repeat what we've done to others in the past. I will say there was a moment when I was reading your book, Amra, and I had read Displacement first. So again, remembering what we've done as a nation. And then I get to the point in your book where your family, the war hasn't officially started in your village yet, in your town. And I think it was your dad makes the comment of, well, it'll be fine because America will come in and flex its muscle 2-3 days and we'll be fine. And I was like, and that's not at all what happened. There's only about 80 years? No, 1940s was the internment camps, and
It's about
we're talking
75
50
to 80.
Yeah, 50 years separate these two events. And so it's just remarkable how long that can seem, but yet how short of a time span that is. One of the things I also wanted to touch on were your moms, because both of your mothers are prevalent in these stories. What was their reaction to you saying, I'm going to write this story, I'm going to, kind of open up our family's history to the world? Kiku, we'll start with you. What was your mom's reaction to the news, and how does she feel about the book now that it's in the world?
It's so interesting because a big part of the research stage, which was the majority of writing, was just research. Researching camps, researching, family history as much as I could. One of the highlights of that process was getting to share things with my mom that she had never known about her own mother. Because there was just so little that was actually spoken about, especially by my grandmother's generation, that it was actually really, it felt very special to be able to bring her these sorts of stories that she hadn't ever heard before, or tell her things about her own mom that she had never heard before, because there was just so much silence and sort of a taboo about talking about camp. So that was very cool, and we're not necessarily as open about everything as we are in the book, but she's been very supportive and very proud and happy that the story is out there.
And Amra, how did your mom react?
My mom being a teacher, and particularly history teacher, She was very happy that I decided to write my story. Um, Obviously, it was not easy, and that is the reason why it took so long for me to make this decision to really make myself vulnerable. And there was only one concern that my mom had, and that is that I have become, by simply telling my story, a target of Serb nationalists again. A couple of years ago, was threatened by a white supremacist, a far-right individual who is a graduate of Columbia University, who
Wow.
who was never my student, who was simply an alum who read a story about me as a Muslim faculty member and the work I was doing. And so my mom is aware that sometimes simply being who I am puts me at risk. And she was worried about me, and she was worried about me. She's worried about me now, knowing that I have multiple interviews a day, and she knows it's emotional, and she knows that it brings back certain element of trauma, just going through it and walking each person that I talk to through my experience. But I do feel that that burden of being a genocide survivor, while heavy, it's important to be shared and in a way inform and educate people on what happened to us. And during the entire process, given that my mom lives with me in the US now, we often talked about certain moments where I had asked my mom, how did you feel? And what was your experience? Because a lot of times in the war, in the midst of survival, I didn't want my mom to worry about me, and she didn't want to share herself fully with me because I was a child and she was trying to protect me. So it really provided a space for us to learn more about our own feelings and experiences during the war that we didn't share necessarily at that time, in desire to protect each other. And I do have to say that today, my book received a 6-star review, which is incredible. I'm humbled by it. But I have to say that with all of that recognition, my mom, when I tell her that I heard from someone who lost the entire family during the genocide, and there are a lot of people who are sending me very long letters and thank yous for simply writing my story, my mom always cries. And it's always a touching moment. And so there's a lot of trauma processing that has happened for my entire family in writing this book that could almost be material for another book, in addition to The Cat I Never Named.
Okay, nice. One of the things that I think you guys did really well was incorporate the actual history of what was going on leading up to these events. Kiku, you know, we do have a lot of books out there about what life was like in internment camps, but even I'm learning through here, I think I missed the part where we actually forced them to, sign those the pledges that they will, serve the United States only, and, where some of the families felt like they were being tricked into something. And if they answered no to one or two of, I think it was questions 27 and 28 or 26 and 27, they were sent to a completely different internment camp. So there's a lot of history there. And I think you kind of even touched on a little bit of the prejudice and racism that Japanese Americans felt when they first started emigrating, going back, back to the 1800s in your story as well. And Amra, I was a fairly new mother when all of this started. So while I kind of vaguely remember hearing all the news, there was a lot of pieces that I just didn't have that I think you wove so beautifully through the story so that we understood a little bit more about the history of the region and how the Civil War started, the genocide, and how all of that happened. So for both of you, how did you keep from bogging your stories down with the history and keeping you know, the storylines moving? Because that, I think for me, that would have been hard, because I would have wanted to be throwing facts and information and all of that for you. So Amra, we'll start with you on that one.
Certainly for me in my sort of day job as an academic, the primary purpose is to throw out facts and overwhelm people with statistics. But one of the sort of things that I had learned in my teaching career, and I would say that my teaching career started more than 25 years ago, when I was asked for the first time to teach in the midst of genocide. My mother our house was bombed. My mom lost her hearing and became deaf as a teacher. And she was not the only teacher who was injured. There were teachers who were killed. So as one of the top students in the country, I was asked to jump in and teach in an elementary school and high school. And I was this kid teacher who really knew nothing about teaching, but I was thrown into the classroom, and for the first time realized in working with kids that I had to find a way to make learning meaningful, not really for the test, not really for the book, but to move them emotionally so that they say, wow, I'm really curious to learn about this issue. And fast forward to now my days at Columbia, I started my career teaching as a statistics professor, and I don't need to probably tell anyone that most people hate statistics. And so I use that knowledge I learned during the war, really pedagogical approach to how to deal with young people, to make statistics more interesting. And I imbued stories and details that would make numbers appealing. And so when I was deciding to write this book, there are many history books out there on what happened in the Balkans. Many are fairly complicated. I just wanted this to be my story. I wanted it to be not overwhelming in terms of information, yet I wanted to make sure that young adults and adults learn enough to understand what really happened, why this genocide began, and why the Serb army executed so many people just on the basis of their religious and ethnic background. So it wasn't easy, I have to say, because I had the same urge as you mentioned to throw in more details, but I tried to keep myself in check.
Well, you did a very good job at it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Kiku, how did you keep from wanting to just throw all of this information at us and just be like, here, blah?
Definitely, I approached it very early on, starting with what I did know purely from family history and from family stories. And there were certain moments that were certainly brought up over and over again. Things like the dust that was at camp. That's a very prevalent detail in Displacement, and in basically any story you hear from survivors of camp. They talk about how dusty it is, the dust got everywhere. So that was one example of a detail that just kept coming up over and over again. The murder of James Wakasa was another one that I had grown up knowing about, a very pivotal moment in camp, and sort of just a very emotional moment. And the loyalty questionnaire, 27 and 28. Again, these were sort of moments that were very emotional. So I wanted to pick the moments that really came up over and over again in my research and in my family as the anchor points of the story, because I know that those are the ones that stuck with us and sort of shaped us as a community. So yeah, I basically chose those details based on how the lasting impact that they've had on us. And that sort of guided me in how I wanted to structure the story. In terms of the pre-camp racism that Japanese Americans faced, I make mention of the Native Sons of the Golden West.
Yes.
One detail that I remember my mom telling me that her mom had talked about the sort of violent racism of this one organization that was really campaigning to kick all Asians, all Japanese Americans out of California. So I made sure to really include that. And I think that these big emotion, like these things that are factual but also deeply emotional within a community are sort of, yeah, the main structure points of the story. It's really about the emotion rather than the fact, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think one of the things both of your books did really well, and I think this is what makes, one of the reasons that makes them so important, is that as you're reading, you want to know so much more. So for both of them, they took me forever to read because I kept having to go to the Googles because I'm like, oh, I need to know more about that Native Sons of the Golden West, right? Like I had never heard of them before. Or I needed to remind myself of what the original Yugoslavia looked like and the countries that it broke into. You know, so I just kept wanting to learn more. I was Googling the cities where the camps were in. I was Googling the cities where you had been in, Amra. So it was just, both of these stories just really not force you, it excites you to want to do more of your own research. And that's when these stories then become personal to us because they drive us to want to know more. And that's the good sign of exquisite storytelling. So thank you both very much for that. But I do want to talk a little bit because both of your stories, there are little glimmers of hope and a little bit of happiness, and they both revolve around love, right? Both Amra, you and Kiku, you know, your characters found their real first loves in these horrible, horrible conditions. So, you know, was that a conscious decision for you guys to include that in the stories? And why did you feel it was important to include those in the story? So Kiku, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think the characters being 16 years old is such a pivotal sort of age when you know, are sort of starting to really feel attraction to people and sort of wanting to explore that. And I mean, I'm a lesbian, and so my character in the book is also gay. And even though it was the 40s, I felt it was important to really show that, you know, LGBT people have always existed.
Yes.
There was a man named Jiro Onuma who was actually in Topaz, the same camp as my grandmother, who was sort of the only documented gay man who was taken to camp, but, you know, documented, but people existed, people found love in their own ways, even back in the 40s. So it felt doubly important to sort of share that story and the lost stories of LGBT Japanese Americans who, you know, were forced into camp, and then also it was that much harder to navigate their identity with so little privacy. But I didn't want it to be a tragic story because I think that, you know, finding love in that situation is such an essential part of the human experience, and people find ways.
It speaks to the resiliency of the human spirit, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the necessary, the ways that people really seek each other out in these times, yeah, it's vital.
Yeah, exactly. And Amra, for you, it was a very personal first love.
It was, and you know, I think there are so many happy moments that we can experience even in the most gruesome, horrific times in our lives. And I'm sure that there are people who in the midst of this pandemic are experiencing some form of love in some ways. And to me, it was important to humanize the story and make myself relatable to teens today by simply telling that I fell in love for the first time in the midst of the war. And as you know, there are different kinds of love that I experience in the war. Not only my first love, which was really driven, it was almost in a way a conscious decision in the war to go there and let myself fall in love, because I was this really great, good kid who only focused on school and getting straight A's and playing volleyball every night before the war. And I played classical guitar and I did everything right. And partly was because my older brother passed away in fact, on October 15th in 1985.
Oh.
And so it's an emotional day for me today. And he died from heart attack at 15. I don't go into specifics and details of that story in this book, but he is mentioned, and it's obvious that he's lost our family and that that was a huge tragedy. He was brilliant. He had photographic memory and just a brilliant young man, but had Marfan syndrome and died from heart attack. And so after his death, I wanted to be this perfect kid, never give a headache to my parents. And that also meant not get in trouble with boys and not fall in love, and keep that for some future time when I grow up. And then I never had the chance to grow up. And then the war happened, and my growing up was overnight. And it was sort of this unimaginable, horrific world in which it just so happens through circumstances that I fall in love with this boy. And it was probably an emotional element that helped me survive during those years and really stay hopeful that the war would end. It also, I think, adds beauty to the story. But I would say, in addition to that love, there's another character in the book that is really honored in the title, and it is the cat I never named.
Yes.
A stray cat that comes with refugees into my hometown just before my city is besieged. And she refuses to leave our family, which was sort of almost strange. She adopted us. My mom didn't want the cat. I think that's made clear in the book.
And that's being kind. Your mom didn't want the cat.
Yeah, my mom was worried about, as a parent, we didn't have almost any food. The war is about to start, and how are we going to take care of another living being? And I was afraid of everything with claws because I was attacked by a German Shepherd when I was younger. And we didn't want her, but she didn't care. So she loved us unconditionally. And as you know, there are a number of instances, including the very first day of bombing of my city on June 12th, 1992, that my brother and I survived. We would have been blown up with 4 of our friends if it were not for Matse, which means kitty in Bosnian. And then there's love in my family. I was lucky to grow up in an incredible family, have an incredible father and mother who kept us together. And then my extended family, I talk about my uncle and aunt. So there's a lot of love in the book. And I think that is something that may surprise the reader who expects a story of genocide.
Yeah. And I think it's important because, again, as I mentioned earlier, right, it shows the resiliency of the human spirit, and we can, hopefully find that beauty in whatever situation that we're at. And then I did want to touch on a little bit, it's almost 7:45. So, but education is really important in both of your stories. And so I loved that parallel between the two of them. Kiku, in yours, it was, at first it was more of the parents in the camp wanting to try and keep life as normal for their kids as possible. So you're going to go to class, you're going to finish, and get your diploma. And Amra, for you, it was almost like a refuge, right? It was a place, school was a place where you could be you. And while some of the teachers maybe didn't appreciate you being a Muslim, there were those that really embraced you for who you were. So what did education mean to you guys in your lives? And Amra, we'll start with you.
I'm gonna share one detail that I think speaks to how important education is in my life and how important I think it should be in everybody's life. There was a moment in the war when my father thought that we would be executed. Serbs were coming closer and closer to our neighborhood. They were burning down a hill across my neighborhood, and we could see them burning houses. We could see them walking really towards our side of the river where we lived. And my father turned to me and said, Amra, I may not be able to save you. You may be raped. But there's one thing that no one can ever take away from you if you survive this, and that is your education. And that really stuck with me because everything was worthless. Everything could have been taken away from me, and many people that I dearly loved were stolen from me. But one thing that no one could take away from me was what I could learn. And that was motivating factor and turning point for me in the war, where I self-empower by learning. So I started teaching myself English. I found my dad's old English dictionary and started memorizing all the words. Couldn't pronounce any of them, had no idea how to pronounce them, but I could spell all of them. And I always tease everybody in my family and say, I can always spell everything. I don't need a spell check from those days. And I started working with immunizing children. I mastered math and physics and won some competitions. And in those days, I did it to better myself, to really love myself, rather than doing it in hope that someone else will stop hating me or stop killing me. And I realized in those days that self-improvement, self-education, even when it's not possible, even now in pandemic, when it started, I told my children who are teens, you need to think about how you can better yourself. Forget about what the school can do for you, what the society can do for you. What is it that you can do for yourself? And that is a lesson that I learned back then and stuck with me. And that's one of the reasons why I had a career on Wall Street for a couple of years after college, because I was a poor scholarship kid and I needed to make sure I can feed my family in Bosnia and help everybody. And when I felt I was comfortable enough, I went to a profession that I always loved, which is education, and becoming a teacher.
Nice. And Kiku, what does education mean for you?
Yeah, one of the aspects of education in the history of Japanese American incarceration camps was the fact that a lot of the first people who were allowed to leave camp were students who were able to go to universities. And that's actually how my grandmother was able to leave camp. She was accepted into Juilliard and was able to actually move to New York earlier than her parents in order to start college. So, you know, people seeking education was not only a means of sort of, you know, continuing their education, but also a means of, it was freedom, quite literally, for them being able to leave camp to go to school. And my grandmother actually also went on to be a teacher. So, but I think also in terms of sort of the message of displacement in the story itself, it's also about the kinds of things that we teach our children and the kinds of things that we pass down as a community, and that sort of community social education is so important. You know, school can do a lot for you and it can represent literal freedom, but there's also the aspect of you know, what you learn from your elders, what you learn from your grandparents, from your parents, and those are, again, not necessarily always the historical fact of the matter. You know, there are rumors that work their way into these sorts of things, especially in a situation like incarceration camps where there's so little information that the incarcerees even have about their own situation. But there's the vital sort of emotion and the feeling and the way that it sticks with the community, and the stories that the community passes down is its own special kind of education that is equally vital, I think, if not more so, sort of keeping that story alive.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's the perfect place to kind of end this portion of the discussion about the importance of education and why we need to have these books and these stories in our lives. And I'm going to close. Amra, I wanted to read a little bit from your book. It's actually your math teacher, if I remember correctly, the day that you guys all arrived to school and realized that all the Serbs got the secret message to get out of town, but you guys are all stuck. And so it just kind of reinforces why it's so important to have people like you, Kiku, and like you, Amra, writing these stories and not being afraid to share your history with us. Again, the good, bad, and the ugly, because this is how we learn and this is how we become better people. So he says, I'm ashamed for my people, he says, and now anger flashes through his despair. For the Serbs and for the human race. We have been humans for 200,000 years. We have had written language for 5,000 years. We've been to space. He runs his hands through his hair, making it wilder than ever. Yet, somehow, we cannot learn not to hate each other. And hopefully, as we get more and more people to read your stories, as we get more stories like these in the world, maybe we'll finally figure out what it means to treat each other with respect and dignity and compassion. So ladies, thank you so much for these amazingly powerful stories that Kerry and I and the rest of the Andersons team have just loved putting into people's hands. And I can't wait to see what you guys have next coming out. So thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you.
So with that, Kerry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, ladies. That was an amazing discussion. Actually, I really enjoyed that. I called my children in and made them listen to parts of it as well. It was really moving. Both of your stories are so moving. We do have a couple of questions that came through the chat. I'm going to start with one from Aranza. She says, this is for Kiku. What was the research process like in preparation to write the book, especially since you never met your grandmother?
Yeah, so I mentioned before the sort of key moments that have been sort of passed down through my family, key details about the camp experience. You know, there were few, but they were impactful. The loyalty questionnaire, the murder of James Ukasa, these were sort of springboards. And one of the main resources that I used to sort of find out the context for these events was an archival website called Densho, which I highly recommend if you're looking for more information about Japanese American incarceration. Densho is an amazing experience, or an amazing organization that has just a huge encyclopedia of archival information. They did interviews with survivors. They've collected family documents and family memoirs and things like that. And they have it all online that you can access, which is hugely helpful. So that was a huge help. It's funny, I also actually accessed my great grandfather's FBI record, which exists in the National Archives. So that was really interesting too. Interesting to see the kind of the level of detail that the FBI kept on my great grandfather, who didn't do anything really his whole life. I mean, nothing illegal or anything. So, but there's just files and files of paperwork on him. So these sorts of things that are kept by the government for surveillance purposes and later I used as research.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. That's cool. All right, our other question, and we'll close with this one. We've got just enough time, is from Kim. Thank you, Kim. Thank you for the courage you show in sharing your stories and your lives. So many important lessons here. What do you hope America learns from these tumultuous times so that we don't repeat the past mistakes? I'll start with you, Amra.
There's so much I could say there. We could probably stay here till tomorrow morning. But I would say that I would hope that from my story, America and Americans who read my memoir recognize that we are capable of horrific things as human beings, and that we have to be cognizant of that. There's a moment in the book when I have conversation with my father, and I conclude that really being a good person is a person who constantly questions if they're doing the right thing. And once we stop questioning and blindly follow, that is when we enter the dangerous zone, when genocidal ideas become the unbearable reality. And that is exactly what happened to me. I was very much like American teens today. I never expected that I would be living in war. My own uncle, who was a Serb living in Belgrade as one of the high-ranking officers who married into my mom's family, was part of the group of people who were willing to execute me. So the extent to which narrative of exclusion can dehumanize the other is hard to imagine unless you had lived it. And I hope that Americans feel that I can learn that lesson from my story, and that they can learn how to be better people. I think we need to learn to have conversations. We no longer can talk to people at the dinner table who disagree with us. And I hope we can do a better job at that, because I worry that if we don't, we won't have a dinner table to share.
Wow, very timely advice.
Yeah.
And for you, Kiku, what do you hope America learns from these tumultuous times?
Yeah, similar to Amra, I think there's so much that could be covered. But among them, I think one of the things that I really wanted to focus on with displacement was that when we, as a nation, which has, again, a long history of these acts of racist violence, from the very beginning of the country, you know, the genocide of the native populations, the slavery, everything. We have a huge history of these sorts of racist, violent moments and continuation of those moments. But I think that it's easy to think of these as isolated events, like, you know, slavery was in the past, segregation was in the past, incarceration camps are in the past. Why do you have to keep bringing it up? But the fact is, and the thing that I tried to explore in displacement was that these things leave lasting scars on the entire community and on the country as a whole. There's a loss of culture, there's a loss of richness within these communities. There's a loss of personal history and of community history and of community vibrance, I think. And that can almost never be reclaimed. And so it's not just one act of violence in a moment in time. It is a continued thing that lasts through generations that has a deep impact on the country as a whole.
Two very good answers. Thank you very much for that, you guys. All right. Well, that is it for us tonight here at Anderson's Bookshop. On behalf, again, of Anderson's Bookshop, I want to thank our authors and Kathleen and all of you who came tonight. And again, just thank everyone for their continued support as we get through this bizarre and crazy time that we are living in right now. Good luck to everybody out there. Please stay healthy. Please stay safe. And of course, vote if you are of voting age. So good night, everybody. Have a lovely rest of your...
Thank you, Amra.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.